Welcome back. Continuing the topic about Nazi Germany at war and its impact on Europe. This is the second podcast. Okay, so in the first podcast we looked at the causes of the war, the origins of the war, and we reached the point, we reached the date, the 3rd of September 1939, when of course Britain and France declared war on Germany in retaliation to, or in response to Germany invading Poland on the 1st of September 1939, which you remember was at the next step of a series of steps of eastward expansion. Remember, Hitler miscalculated there. He never really wanted to be at war with Britain. His objectives, remember, are always eastward expansion. But now, of course, he has to deal with the British issue. Okay, so this podcast is focusing in on the early years of the war, 1939 to 41. Now, again, just to emphasise, in terms of a GCSE question, it is most likely you're going to get a general question about Germany during the whole of World War II. And in many ways, because the experiences of the German people during the war changed over time, the best structure, and I have done podcasts, separate podcasts that look at model answers, which I've written on for these sorts of questions. But the best structure is to write a series of paragraphs, each paragraph focusing on a different time period. My best advice is 3 main paragraphs. The first paragraph focuses in on the early years, 39 to 41. The middle paragraph focuses in on the turning point years, 1942 to 43. And then the third paragraph focuses in on the end of the war, 1944 to 45. So you write a paragraph on each of those time periods. So that's the approach of these podcasts. This podcast is focusing in on the early years. So think to yourself that you would need to write a paragraph on this in the exam. Okay, so let's just take you through the key points that you would need to make in that paragraph. First of all, it's always worth just letting the examiner, always let the examiner know you understand the context. Okay. Even if you're only stating it in a couple of sentences. So I'll just explain what the context was, where you can see it as the heading there. The years 1939 to 40 were years of astonishing victories for Germany. Okay, it very much seemed as if Germany was going to win World War II right at the very beginning. Okay. A key phrase to have in your mind, in a sense, is Britain alone. Okay, we do tend to think with World War II that Germany was fighting against Russia and against America, but the war against Russia and America did not happen until 1941. In 1939 and 1940, the only real enemy that Germany had was Britain. Okay. France too, but France was defeated very, very quickly. So I'll just take you through these sort of key points. Okay. So remember, last time we saw how in 1938 Germany incorporated Austria and then the border of Czechoslovakia and then the rest of Czechoslovakia in early 1939, and then on the 1st of September they invaded Poland. Okay. That was eastward expansion without having to go to war with Britain. But Britain then, of course, on the 3rd of September declared war on Germany. Okay, so a declaration of war. Now, Hitler's, there's point 1, the invasion of Poland, and there's point 2, Britain alone. I put the phrase the phony war because the period from September 1939 to May 1940, sort of think to yourself the first 7 or 8 months of the war, was a very strange period. It's like all the people of Britain were bracing themselves for a big German attack, and it never came. Okay, why did it never come? Because in a sense, Hitler, having invaded Poland, and of course Germany conquered Poland and remember, just drawing the sort of the line of the invasion there, Germany expanded there. Um, Germany needed to sort of take a pause to stockpile, to build up weapons for the next phase. Now, of course, what Hitler wanted the next phase to be was a further attack eastwards against the Soviet Union, but he now had to deal with this irritating problem of Britain. So, at first, he sent a message to Britain in October 1939 appealing for Britain to pull out of the war. Hitler actually admired the British. He saw them as sort of like a fellow Aryan country. There were deep-rooted links between Germany and Britain, for example, through the royal families, etc. And he didn't really want to be at war with Britain, but Britain had declared war, so he accepted the fact that he had to deal with that. Now, Hitler's strategy for dealing with Britain was to surround Britain. Okay, now to surround Britain, it meant he had to occupy the countries close to Britain. So effectively, his early strategies were, and as you can see at point number 3, he first of all invaded Belgium, and then he invaded Holland, and then in April 1940 he invaded northern France and Denmark, and although it's off the map, he also invaded Norway in the north. So what basically he was doing, if I draw that line, is he was surrounding Britain so that he could put pressure on Britain, okay, to pull out of the war. Now ultimately Britain did not pull out of the war. Winston Churchill became Prime Minister, and so Hitler reluctantly in the summer of 1940 had to again delay all plans to invade Russia, and he had to basically put all his forces over to the west and attack Britain, the so-called Battle of Britain. I won't go into the details of the Battle of Britain. The key point is that was Hitler's first military defeat. He failed to defeat Britain. Britain clung on. Okay, but nevertheless it was still Britain alone. So in the early 1941, Hitler made his first big mistake. He then decided to invade the Soviet Union, okay, without having defeated Britain first. Okay, more on that in a minute. Now, in terms of the key points you want to make, I mean, you don't go into all of that unless the question is specifically asking you about the military strategy, which it probably won't. That's just really to help your understanding, okay? The key points you really want to make is that it is the points about the home front, the German people, okay? Now, if I were you, I would sort of focus on two things. One, first of all, what was their morale? What was the mood of the German people? And then secondly, what were their actual physical experiences? Now, in terms of the mood of the German people, yes, there was no great enthusiasm for war. Unlike in 1914 when World War I broke out, people were not out in the streets, flying the flags and all that sort of stuff. There was a mild anxiety, but it was no more than that, okay? Make the point that really people did trust Hitler. Hitler had got everything right in a way up to 1939. He'd crushed communism, he'd created jobs, and he'd expanded Germany's frontiers eastwards without actually going to war. And there was a mild alarm, but no more than that, okay? Germany had been preparing for war for some time as well. So in terms of the experiences of the German people, and use that phrase, the home front, life continued as normal to some extent. Don't over-egg that, don't state it as if there was no change. There was limited change. But in contrast to, for example, the experiences of the British people at the start of World War II, and for example in Britain, women were conscripted into the factories straight away. Anderson shelters and Morrison, you'll do all that in the Impact of War unit, were being built. Children were evacuated. Rationing was introduced big time in Britain, really serious restrictions on food because the British were so anxious about a German blockade, about Germany cutting off food supplies to Britain. Germany introduced all of those, but to a lesser degree than Britain, okay? Because Hitler was very anxious not to sort of like impact on the morale of the people. Hitler, as a dictator, throve on popularity. He needed the popularity. Remember, we did a lesson about the cult of the Führer, okay? And again, as a dictator, the Nazis had a very, very strong control over the media, and that influenced people's attitudes as well. And Joseph Goebbels' propaganda effectively convinced the Germans that the war would be won quickly. So there's the point about anxious to keep morale high. Main impact was rationing. Okay, there's the point. Rationing was introduced, but it was limited. Okay, there were pre-prepared ration cards. Okay, so people could not buy whatever they wanted in the shops. Yeah, Hitler was anxious about the British shooting down German merchant vessels that were bringing food. So key foods, so make sure you learn those. But it was limited, so make sure you emphasise that word limited. Women, there was limited conscription, but unlike in Britain where all women could be conscripted to work in the factories, in Germany it was mainly limited to unmarried and young women. Key workers, going back to ration cards, key workers, heavy industry, munitions and long hours could only use, effectively got more rations. So again, that's the sort of key thing on the whole of fair system. So that's why I put photographs on those two slides of sort of smiley, happy people. In a sense, that was partly Goebbels' propaganda. Yeah, that he took those photographs for propaganda reasons. But on the whole, for many Germans, life continued as normal. Now, of course, the period ended, and this is a link to the next podcast, with Germany attacking the Soviet Union. Okay, so there's the big eastwards attack. Of course, Germany has already occupied Poland, and then, of course, in June 1941, the biggest invasion in history. Okay, stretching along a 3,000-mile front from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Wasn't all done by the Germans. He had allies. Hungary and Romania down in the south were allied to Germany, but it was the biggest invasion in history. And I suppose the impression was that it was enormously successful, because by December 1941 the Germans had literally advanced to within literally hundreds of yards away from Moscow. They were that close to the capital city, Moscow. So if you look at the map of Germany as it was by the end of 1941, Britain's still alone, okay? Britain's still alone. If you take the 1st of December 1941, okay, in a sense, Russia is now in the war on Britain's side, but the Soviet Union, of course, hasn't been defeated. It looks as if the Soviet Union has been defeated. So you've got that enormous success there. So again, just to sort of highlight, remember, before World War II broke out, Austria, I'll sort of change the colour there, Austria had been invaded, the Sudetenland, the rest of Czechoslovakia, then of course Poland, then of course the Low Countries, the Netherlands, France, Denmark, Norway, okay, all of those things. The light pink areas are of course Hitler's allies. In particular, Italy was an ally of Germany, led by Mussolini. And then of course the huge invasion through occupied Poland into Russia in 1941. And effectively, taking into account the light pink areas, which are allied countries, Hitler by the end of 1941 controlled the whole of Europe and also much of European Asia. Okay. Then on the 7th of December 1941, America joined the war on Britain's side. And that's a link to the next podcast. They're the usual questions, okay? So make sure you review those and the answers. Thank you very much. If you can move now on to the third podcast.